So let me know when you started. I haven't seen a little red banner come up. There you go. So welcome to today's session, Azure DevOps Duet Cloud8 edition. It's all about how a development team and an operations team must bond together and start using Azure DevOps for data platform deployments. Now, before we get started, we'd like to thank the sponsors for today's event.
So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, the boards, the pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And at the end of this session, you'll have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used to do your data platform deployments.
So, to give this session a bit of context, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team so that we're all one big happy family. In addition, we've been asked to make it future-proof for data engineers as well.
In reality, though, this should be a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 45-minute session or something like that, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, our product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they occur.
Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm from the Netherlands. I am a SQL Server DBA for almost 2 decades now. I am a cloud and data center MVP, and I work for Data Masterminds. I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find my handle right here. I have a blog. And if you have any questions after the session, feel free to send me an email. All the demos you'll see today are available on my GitHub page as well. Let's go to the github.com/my full name and then go to the presentations and look for this presentation and you'll find the demos right there. You can teach them, change them, redistribute them, whatever you want to do with them. They're for you. And now Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me, so go ahead, Kevin.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sander. And on that note, my name is Kevin Chan, and I'm a lead BI and analytics architect living in the Netherlands. Now I have 24 years experience working in IT. And over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and health insurance industries. Now I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, and I have various certifications, including both the new and the old style MCSE. And more recently, I became a Microsoft certified DevOps engineer expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. And in addition to that, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And just like Sander, you can find me on social media using various different ways, as you can see at the bottom of my bio. So anyway, Sander, the first thing to discuss is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services or Azure DevOps Server. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application that you tend to install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, it's now been rebranded to look and feel just like Azure DevOps Cloud Services. Personally, Sander, I'd like to use Azure DevOps Server for security and reporting reasons. However, the downside is that we'd have to install one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we'd have to wait a while for new features to become available because of their cloud-first strategy. In addition to that, we'd have to maintain and patch all the servers that we deploy as well.
But if you use Azure DevOps services in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch and maintain anything because it's all done behind the scenes by Microsoft for you. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure. Besides, whichever we use, we must still consider security and compliance anyway to keep our auditors happy. And it's easy for us to connect to Azure Active Directory, which we need to do if we want to connect to some services to Git repositories within Azure DevOps, for example, the Azure Synapse Analytics workspaces. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is that if you install Azure DevOps server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself. As with the cloud-based service, everything is done behind the scenes for you. And your Azure DevOps organization needs to be connected to Azure Active Directory to easily integrate services like Azure, like Synapse Studio with an Azure DevOps repository.
So, talking about the structure of Azure DevOps, let's go straight in and have a look now. And as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own structure. At the top, you have your account, which is represented by the logo here. In addition to that, and underneath your account, basically, you have access to one or more organizations that you can see here on the left-hand side. For example, now these organizations can be various things. They can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, they can be a division within them, or they can be ones that you've created yourselves for testing, as you can see here. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can actually change various settings at the organization level. So if we go into organization settings, you'll see there's various things we can change. For example, some general settings relating to the organization itself. You can see information about which projects you have on there, some statistics relating to auditing and usage. See which extensions you currently have installed in your organization, which can be very useful. So you know what you can do. And you can connect to Azure Active Directory as well in your general settings. Now, you can set some various settings at the organization level in the security section, including policies, and you can fine-tune permissions as well for everybody. As far as boards are concerned, this directly influences Azure boards, and we will go into a bit more detail about processes shortly. However, it's very important to remember that the board section in organization settings is where you manage your processes for all your different projects in your organization. Now, you can set some various pipeline settings at the organization level here as well, and some repository settings that will affect the entire organization as well, including a default branch name for new repository settings. Now, as some of you may know, there's a little bit of controversy relating to the origins of the master branch naming convention in Git. With this in mind, Microsoft now gives you the ability in Azure DevOps to be able to change the default name of new repositories. And in fact, GitHub have taken a similar stance as well with their new repositories. Plus, if you go to install a Git client like Git for Windows now, you will see you also have this option as well. So it is a pretty significant change. And you can see how much storage your entire organization is using for your artifacts, which we'll cover later. Now, if I go back up to the organization level here, you can see that we have multiple projects within an organization. And if we go into this particular project, you can see all the different services that Sander mentioned earlier on the left-hand side here. And just like at the organization level, if you have the right permissions, you can change settings at the project level as well. So again, you can change some general settings. As you can see, you can change the logo for your project, and this one may look familiar to a couple of people watching this session. You can also manage your teams here as well. So if I click on Teams and click on Default Team, you can see that I can add and remove people from the teams. In addition to that, I can fine-tune permissions for the project here, not just for users and teams, but also for logical groups that you want to create. So for example, if you need to have something like separation of duties to approve releases and pipelines, you can set all of these here. You can change your notification settings here as well, so you can stop getting emails if you find they're getting too much. You can create service hooks directly from your Azure DevOps project directly into third-party services in the cloud. So if I click here, you'll see a whole list of services. And you can manage your dashboards here. And I tend to recommend to leave these as they are. Now, you can change your board settings here as well. So basically you can create your own iterations or sprints depending on whether you're using Agile or Scrum. You can change various settings for your boards here as well. And you can actually change quite easily which team you want to manage at the top here. To manage GitHub connections, so basically you can connect that to an existing GitHub account, so you can view pull requests directly in Azure Boards if you really want to. You can change your pipeline settings at the project level as well, so you can actually create agent pools at the organization level, and again you can manage them at the pipeline level instead if you want to. And there's quite a few different interesting settings you can do here. For example, service connections allows you, for example, to connect that to Visual Studio subscriptions that you may have elsewhere. Again, you can change repositories just like you could at the organization level. However, this time around, you'll actually be able to view all your repositories within your project. If I click on settings, you can see if you don't have the permissions to change your default branch name at the organization level, you can still change it at the project level if you want to. Some interesting policies that you can set here if you want to, and of course security for all your different repositories. And then again, you can view how much storage your artifacts are taking up just for your actual project. And finally, the last default setting is for seeing your test plan policies.
Cool. So now, remember, there are other things we can configure as well if we dive even deeper into these settings. So the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. Anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's cover our version control options with Azure Repos, which is a feature in Azure DevOps.
Oh, you mean like SourceSafe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern. I actually worked with this product a long time ago. But Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems, including something called Git.
Well, that'll only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think you'll see that when ops teams start to use version control, they will start to perform better. So I've seen in the past that if ops teams start to use the version control for their scripting or for their documentation or anything like that, and put everything in source control, it can be used throughout the IT department, which makes it more efficient and everything can be followed along.
Well, I'm always game for performing better, so tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems because we want to have a distributed version control system, and Git would be better for us.
Okay, so what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Well, there's various ones that we can use. For example, there's the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Yeah, and they are. The major difference between them is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. So there's always a development branch of some sort. With the GitHub workflow, there is not a development branch. There are only feature branches. And those are, after, of course, when they're tested successfully, merged into the main branch right away. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming between dev and ops members, they can actually get used to it.
Peer programming?
No, pair programming. So this is where two people write code together, and you would usually do this sitting next to each other. I know with all the COVID stuff, that is probably not going to work very well, but research has shown it actually takes a bit longer to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and people learn new coding practices better.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Yeah, you would think that, and you would be correct. There's about a 15% overhead involved, but that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And bug fixes cost a lot of money the further along they get to a production release. There are other methods that we can use as well, like code reviews. And at the end of the day, we just have to experiment what works best for us.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
I'm glad you asked. So there is something called a branching policies within Azure DevOps that we can use. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data.
Yes, we do.
And I'll just quickly show a demo of that now. And this seems to not want to change the size. So if we go into here, this is basically a GUI representation of how Git repositories that people tend to deal with look in Azure DevOps. To make the repository SOX compliant, we can actually go directly into what's called branch policies. Now from here, we can set the minimum number of reviewers to 2. So if I click on here, for example, it basically means that the pull-away principle is in place because 2 people have to approve the pull request. In addition to that, to actually ensure the pull request actually takes place, you have to select to automatically include reviewers. Otherwise, it doesn't automatically happen. So for example, here, I can add Sander. And that's it.
Yeah. So these are the main points we want you to take away from this part about Azure repos. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems, including Git and TFVC. However, Git has become the facto standard nowadays. So if you have the choice, I would just go for Git. In addition, you can secure your secure updates using branching policies, like you've seen Kevin demonstrate just now. And Git also hooks in very nicely with other tools like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio as well.
Okay, so we better quickly discuss Azure Boards, since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards can use basic Agile Scrum or CMMI templates for each project that you create in Azure DevOps. As I mentioned earlier when I went through the organization screen, these templates are also called a process. Now, because we're using Scrum Standard, we'll probably want to use the Scrum process. For now, we can actually keep it as standard, but we can customize things that in these processes if we want to. And I can actually quickly show you now all the default features that comes with Azure Boards, which are work items. So it shows all your work items in a linear format. Very good if you want to retrieve removed items. So if I click on removed, you can find them easier here. You have boards, which is useful for those of you who want to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. And then you have backlogs, which will show you all your outstanding backlog items in a linear format. Then you have sprints, which are very useful for those who work in sprints. You can actually view your active task board here, assign tasks, etc. And then queries as well, so you can create your own custom queries to find out things about the various backlog items.
Okay, but how are the backlog items organized for Scrum?
Well, glad you asked. As you can see here, if I go back into the backlog and actually go up to the epic level, there actually is a structure here by default of epics. So basically backlog items have one or more epics followed by one or more features that contain one or more backlog items. Now, if we're using an agile process, it would actually be a hierarchy of epics, features, and then user stories instead. And you can actually customize all of this as well inside Azure DevOps, so you can change it slightly.
Okay.
By the way, I forgot to mention, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure boards with all your work items?
Well, steady on, Kevin. We only have like 45 to 60 minutes to go, so.
That's fine. In that case, I will just quickly mention that people can use Power BI Desktop to connect up to analytics views, which people will see towards the end of the session. Anyway, the main thing I want you to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Okay, so let's talk about Azure pipelines, which is where we'll actually look to build and deploy our deliverables.
So how would this work with SQL Server?
So the first thing we have to decide is whether or not we're going to use state-based or migration-based deployments.
What's the main difference between those two?
Well, state-based is like the destination of your journey, where you will deploy something in its entirety. So the destination is what you will get. You will compare your project to the target, and that is being deployed. And during that process, it checks for all the changes, creates a script, and deploys your changes to the target. With migration-based, it's more the journey towards your destination, where you will start at one point and any change that happens along the way will be in an individual script. And you have to deploy all the scripts to make a certain state of your database. And I think for our situation, because the way we've set up our infrastructure and everything, state-based would be better for us. There's a lot of debate on the internet whether to use state-based or migration-based deployments, and that is an entire session on its own. So if you're interested in that, please look that up in your search engine in Google or anything like that. You will find lots of articles about that. But it's fairly easy to build a state-based project for SQL Server updates, as I will demonstrate right now. If you will unshare your screen, Kevin. So I will share that screen, and you can see my Visual Studio project, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So when I had to build a lot of projects for our database and databases, I had to go through the process.
Sander,
yeah.
I'm not seeing your Visual Studio. I'm actually seeing your PowerShell. Is that correct?
No, it's not PowerShell.
I know, I stand corrected. It's Visual Studio Code.
It's Visual Studio.
You're using that plugin. Okay.
Yeah, I'm using a different theme. So when I had to do this for about 30 to 40 databases, create the project or create the solution and create multiple projects inside that solution, put all the objects for all the unit testing and everything in it. That was a lot of work. So what I did instead is I used the PS module development PowerShell module to create a template for that entire directory structure of my SSDT solution. And with that, I can just run a single command, and all this code that you'll see right now is just to get the latest package, latest version of my template, download it, extract it. But the most important part is this little command is the invoke psmd template. And if I run that little script right here, and one, create the SSD project, it will download that latest template from my GitHub page, and then it creates the project for me. And that's it. It's already done. It's done in seconds. And if I open that, it takes seconds to load. You will see two projects within my solution. One is the data project, which contains the data model. And the other one is the tests project, which has an inheritance from the data project. So all my objects are in here. And I wanted to separate those because I want to be able to either deploy just the data model to a production release or include all the tests for the tests or the acceptance or any server that I want in that stream. So that is how you can create that project. If I then go to my database, I could just do an import. Select the connection. And of course, I did this before. I'm going to change this to object type. And then I'm going to say start. And it's going to import my all the objects from my database. Finish. Is it finished? Let's give it a couple seconds. Come on. Wait. Not sure what happened. Demo gods are not in favor of me.
Apparently not today. So what would be the end result of you doing this anyway?
Well, all the objects will be in here, and I'm just going to close this. I'm just going to end this task and start Visual Studio again because it should be in there right now. Let's open it. Let's see if our objects are in there. No, not yet. I'm going to do it again because I am that stubborn. Must be the heat in my room. Here we go. Getting on the wheels. Taking longer than usual.
Well, I hope you're not expecting me to play interlude music for you. I think
No.
maybe if the demo gods are not on your side right now, or the guards as well, the same. I suggest we move forwards of this and you explain a bit more about the unit testing side of it that you mentioned just now.
Yeah, so I'm a fan of unit testing, and as we have a lot of objects, so I created like 50 different objects. But I wanted to create something like the basic unit tests for all the objects that we had, like test if they are there. Is my table there? Is my store procedure available? Does my table have the correct columns with the correct data type with the correct length? Does my function have the correct parameters? Do I have all the indexes on my table? Go on and on and on. So what I did instead of doing that all manually, I created a PowerShell module called the PSTSQL test generator. If I open that, I go and show you create unit tests. So it's called the PST SQLT test generator, and it's available on the PS Gallery. And what this will do is it looks at the current state of your database and then generates all these tests for you on the fly. So if I run that, create the unit tests, it's going to connect to my database. Do I still have that folder open? Yep. And if I go to my test basic, you will see that it will start and write all these tests to my folder. And after it's done, I can just go in. By the way, this time it did work, the import. Not sure what happened. I can go in and go to my test basic. This is a folder that I created. It could be any folder that you create for that. And go to the test basic and import all of this right in here. And now I have all my tests in source control. I am able to do some basic unit testing for my database in a matter of minutes. And I'll show you one of these. Still trying to get synchronized. I think my PC is actually trying to be the better of me. But at least these tests will be generated for you. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show you, but please run the code and you will see what happens for all these unit tests.
However, we're going to show you how it looks in the pipeline shortly anyway.
Yeah.
So stay tuned.
So back to you, Kevin.
So as you were doing that, I was experimenting a little bit, and I saw that we can use either GUI tasks or YAML for our pipelines. So which should we use?
Well, you know my opinion. We should use YAML because, well, the GUI is good for exploring things if you're not really familiar with pipelines. But in the end, YAML is easier to do, and it's just one straight way of doing things, regardless of the platform, either Azure DevOps or GitHub.
That's true. And as you can probably see, I've just taken the screen away from you because I wanted to show that whilst you were talking, I actually experimented a little bit and created a pipeline of my own. And for those of you wondering how to get to your pipelines in Azure DevOps, just go to Pipelines, which is your Azure Pipeline Service, and select Pipelines. And if you go to Edit, when I go to View the Pipeline, as you can see here, Sander, and I'll actually go through this again just to make this clearer for everybody. So you can just click on your pipeline, click on the process, and as you can see down here, I actually created this whilst you were talking away.
Nice.
And so basically I kept the build and unit testing stages that your tool actually creates by default. And then I have to admit, I did remove the SQL Server 2017 one because I didn't want to do unit testing for SQL 2017. And from there, what I actually did was deployed first of all to 3 different SQL Server 2019 instances, which are actually running as Docker containers on my laptop. And they represent the 3 different things, as you can see here. And they actually represent the 3 different environments that you tend to deploy to in a deployment pipeline, including an integration environment where you tend to do user acceptance tests, like integration tests even. I'm jumping ahead there. Then your staging environment, which is where you actually really do your user acceptance tests. And then, of course, your production environment. And those actually went and deployed just fine. And then from there, I actually added another stage, as you can see here, to sync to a GitHub repository. So your repository from earlier is actually now syncing with GitHub as well, which is possible. And then we can take advantage of GitHub actions as well if needed. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can also deploy to an Azure SQL database. And as you can see here, I got that to work. And I actually created a different artifact to do that. And then I went to try to deploy to an Azure Synapse dedicated SQL pool as well. And how I did that was behind the scenes, I run some PowerShell in the actual YAML syntax itself, which actually converted the SQL project to be ready to be deployed to an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool instead. And that worked as well. And just to show you how that looks here, basically you can view your database here, which is in the dedicated SQL pool. And here you can see there's a column that I keep changing very often. So what do you think about that particular pipeline?
Well, that is really really cool. We can, of course, these kind of deployments, we can do something with PowerShell as well. Instead, from your YAML to handle our deployments if we're dealing with a large number of servers.
How would we know if that worked?
Well, we could simply get PowerShell to output the XML in a JUnit format for the test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use that XML to publish the test results, which we can then view visually. Of course, there are other feedback mechanisms in place for deployments as well.
We can do that?
Yeah, we can.
Awesome. So if we go to edit a pipeline, so if I go back here a minute into a pipeline and edit, are we just limited to all of these different tasks that we see here on the right-hand side?
No. In fact, you can install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace and add more tasks to your entire selection. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we may have to request we can install them instead of being able to install them straight away, which is something you usually do with whichever team manages Azure DevOps for the whole enterprise.
I didn't realize that was a thing.
Oh, yes. And it does mean that we can get help with those security and compliance issues we were talking about earlier. Plus, if I get the feeling we have to install Synapse workspace deployment extension anyway, because I know you've already been asked if it's possible to redeploy a workspace artifacts to another one. And from what you mentioned, you can do that, right?
Yeah, it's possible if you've got a workspace in a development environment and one, say, for example, a production environment, you can use the CI/CD and Azure pipelines to, have a deployment pipeline for the two different ones. And the extension, is available to use in Azure DevOps. Anyway, let's move forwards from talking about Azure pipelines, because I've seen that we can use Microsoft hosted agents even for our own network on premises, which are the servers that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of the build and release tasks that we saw earlier in the CI/CD pipelines, like building the various artifacts and deploying them. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we would have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we're better off building our own agents internally.
Maybe, but do remember that a lot of us are developers and we don't really want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out exactly what software we need to install on those agents and maintain them. What's that?
So, as I hope you can all see here, Microsoft actually provides guides on how to create your images of their various agents in GitHub. The name may be a bit confusing to some of you, and the reason it's called this is that actually you can use the same images for GitHub Action Runners as well. So you can use the same images for your Azure DevOps agents and your GitHub Actions Runners.
Ooh. So, well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that running something through the command line, you can get more detailed results, right?
Well, I tested this earlier. Shall we see the results on the next slide?
Yeah. And behold. Oh, there's not much there, Kevin.
You get one line per job.
Okay, next part. Test plans. So of course, we can do something with test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release elsewhere.
Don't they all have to be automated though? Because that would take a lot of effort for some items.
Not necessarily. Your test plans can have manual steps as well, which you can see yourself. So you actually have the ability to do that.
In that case, let's have a look now. So if I go down to test plans, and we should probably explain at this part that the test plans, Azure test plans, so to speak, is kind of is semi-structured. So you have your test plan, which can contain your test suites, which contain one or more test cases, which can in turn contain one or more test plans. However, your test suites can also just contain test plans as well. So if I click on this one that we created earlier, then I click here, you can actually see that a test plan actually appears. So as you can see here is actually an example of the pipeline that we showed you everybody earlier. And as we go through a test plan, we can obviously tick if things work or not. So this is quite good, and the rest of this window is quite intuitive. And there is a desktop version of this, but it obviously, as well as actually having to make sure you have the permissions to install it, it also tries to appear on your main monitor. So you may need to change your monitor settings if you're using the desktop client instead. And feel free to reach out to us to ask if there's any questions, because obviously we're fully aware of the time. So over to you, Sander.
Yeah, we better briefly discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like NuGet packages with others. For example, we can create a NuGet package you can share within Azure artifacts for others to use. To help you to remove some jargon for you, a feed is basically a source that people can access to download packages, which can be online somewhere on your or on your network. For you Linux people, it's basically a repository. And these feeds can be configured to host for a variety of packages, package types actually, including NuGet, npm, Maven, Python, and universal packages as well.
Yeah, and like Sander said, that there are various package types, including universal package. So to give you a very, very short idea of how this works, you can see there's actually an artifact feed we have in place at the moment, and it's got one on there called DBA tools. If you click on here, for example, it will actually give you the syntax that you can use to download one of these artifacts. So what you would then do, you could actually run this syntax and download the contents of the artifact directly on your computer. So it won't download it as a zip file, it will actually download the entire contents of the whole feed for you. And it has been tested by Microsoft, this universal package type, up to 1 terabytes in size. So you can actually use it for large binary files if you really want to. So, however, there are a few issues at the moment if you log in using your own Active Directory account. So some people are struggling a bit. So one workaround that you can use is to log into the Azure CLI using your PAT token instead of your own Azure account.
And PAT is a personal access token for people that don't know.
Forgot to mention about that piece of jargon there. And anyway, to be honest, there are other features in Azure DevOps I'm looking forward to the team using. Like, for example, the various dashboards that we can configure. And this is why I said earlier that I recommend you keep your dashboard settings as they are. They can be very powerful. And for example, as you can see here, we've got the Sprint Go extension installed. You can actually put in your Sprint Go as part of your daily stand-up. So every day you can remind your team what the actual sprint goal is, as well as obviously other useful statistics.
Cool. Don't forget the wiki.
Oh yeah. So there's a wiki as well that you can use, and you can use very powerful markdown inside of this particular wiki, embed videos, etc., etc. Also, as well, there's the analytics views, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll just briefly say now, basically all these different analytics views provide you with various information about the work items and Azure boards. And what you would do is actually connect to these in Power BI desktop, which will then allow you to be able to publish the various reports and dashboards in Power BI. And of course, there's the Azure DevOps extension for CLI as well, which we can use as an alternative to the portal if people want to do that instead. And also remember that everybody is eligible to create their own Azure DevOps organization and test things on as well. And if you create your own organization and then you share it with other people who happen to have Visual Studio subscriptions, it can bring you additional benefits as well. So for example, up here, just click on new organization. You may have some issues if you do this inside large enterprises. They may have some policies, so you may want to check with your Azure DevOps support team.
Yeah. And this is just in case you want to test out things without the fear of breaking anything in your company's Azure DevOps organization. You can just do it in your own version as well. So, Kevin, now we know all of this. Where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve.
Okay. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today, folks. Yeah, I wonder if there are any questions.
I'm actually going to put in the chat now that the link for the schema for the link for more information about the YAML schema for Azure DevOps pipelines. So if people are interested in knowing more about the actual YAML schema, they can find out more about it here. Yeah, we do recommend that you use the newer YAML pipeline environment as opposed to the classic editor, which will give you the GUI view. Of course, the GUI is good at first for getting used to the ideas of using Azure DevOps, but for long-term enterprise solutions, and YAML is probably the way forwards.
Yeah, and if you click any of the extensions, you don't have to write all the YAML yourself. You just fill in the extensions with the values you need, and it will be converted to YAML inside your pipeline. So you don't have to do everything yourself. So it's just something getting used to. But if you're coding anyway, why wouldn't you use anything like YAML?
Indeed. And obviously, if anybody's got any questions, even if you're just watching the recording of this video, you feel free to reach out to myself or Sander if you've got any questions. Gladly help anybody at all in the entire community with any questions relating to this. We do get asked quite a lot of questions. Case in point, at one stage a while back, I think I spent about 2 hours answering questions about Azure boards by itself.
Nice.
So we are willing to help, basically.
Yep.
And I am going to stop sharing my screen. I unfortunately did not get the QR code for the feedback. I'm kind of hoping that somebody watching this session may have it to hand. But I will click on that now.